Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 277, The Buckjumper. Warning, there is reference to deceased Aboriginal persons in this episode, and there are also terms that are considered not suitable today. Billy Waite was born on the 5th of July 1880 on a sugarcane property at Breadalbane in Queensland. It was said that his mother was Aboriginal. George Augustus Henry Waite claimed that Billy took on his surname. Billy was brought up on his Breadalbane property and subsequently took on the Waite family name. Billy grew up carting cane, droving cattle and horse riding at Breadalbane station. As a youngster, he was known as the champion sprinter in the 50-yard, 100-yard and 200-yard races at Proserpine. At the age of 14, he caught one of the brumbies and rode it to Bowen and back in 11 hours to fetch a doctor to help in a shooting accident. In an extract titled How to Tackle a Vicious Horse, Billy Waite wrote, "It may interest you to know that hundreds of wild horses used to roam about the ranges near my home. They're called brumbies, and once broken in, they possess remarkable endurance. I caught one once when I was only 14 and soon broke him in. He came in very useful not long after. A boy was shot by accident at Glen Isla and the nearest doctor was 52 miles away at Bowen. I saddled my brumby and rode off at 7 p.m. You can imagine the power of my mount when I tell you I came back with the doctor at 6 a.m. the next morning, covering 104 miles in 11 hours. One of the biggest jobs I ever tackled in my life was during the South African War, when I rode 450 horses in 2.5 days for the government inspection for active service at the front. On the first day I rode 250, which I believe is a record, trotting each of them 50 yards or so and cantering them back. The rogues were cast aside and only the tractable ones selected for service. I had 6 men catching and saddling them for me. And there are a couple of articles that mentioned his part in the war effort for the Boer War. I knew Waite on the Breadalbane station in North Queensland when he was a boy. Later on, when the Boer War started, he secured a job breaking in remounts at the old police camp near Bowen. As every second horse managed to throw him out of the saddle, he lasted only a week. And on the 7th of November 1933, in the Richmond River Herald and Northern District's Advertiser of New South Wales, there was a recollection. At the time of the Boer War, Billy Waite was employed in breaking in remounts at the Proserpine depot. He'd been employed round that district carting sugar to the Proserpine mine. A half-caste Aboriginal, he was a fine stamp of an athlete and was the recognised crack runner and jumper of the party. Commissioner Ryan, now head of the Police Department of Queensland, was in charge at Proserpine at the time. He was a fine runner and was anxious to match himself against Waite over the 100, 150 and 200 yards. But the match did not come off. Waite gained fame afterwards with Martini. And the Martini mentioned was Martini's Buckjumping show that came north from Mackay in 1903, and this changed Billy's life dramatically. The star attraction of Martini's Buckjumping show was a horse named Dargan's Grey. Few could stay in his saddle. The challenge was that if you could stay on Dargan's Grey back for 1 minute, you could win £5. Waite and another Aboriginal man, Billy Emerson, were keen to accept the challenge to attempt to earn a few pounds and fame. Neither stayed in the saddle very long, but Martini was impressed with their ability and invited them to join the show. Being Aboriginals, they were denied the freedom to leave the district. Journalist Bill Boyang, who was working at Proserpine at the time, contacted the local member for Bowen and sought permission for them to join the show. 2 days later, a telegram of consent arrived and they met the show at Burdekin. Billy Emerson returned home, but Billy Waite continued with the show. In about 1904, Billy married Marion Margaret Smith, who was born in Walcher, New South Wales, in 1879. On the 18th of June 1904, in the Charters Towers Northern Miner, there was an advertisement for buckjumping at the Cremorne Gardens, and it says, on a return visit after 14 months' tour of the North, Martini's Australian Roughriders and 12 champion buckjumpers. £100 challenge to all newcomers. Martini has deposited £10 with the manager of this paper to back Dargan's Grey for £100 to throw any rider in Australia in a saddle in less than 5 minutes. Other stars showing, and it mentions Billy Waite and Jim Haddon's exhibitions of rough riding in Poley saddles. On the 25th of June 1904, in the Charters Towers Evening Telegraph, it mentions Billy Waite, who is still with Martini, and tried his luck with no better result as the old fellow landed him heavily in double quick time. And on the 31st of August 1904, in Rockhampton, Queensland, some notorious outlaws are sent into the ring, and all of them bar one are ridden by Billy Waite, the champion rider in an English saddle. Dargan's Grey, the champion buckjumper of Australia, looks all he is said to be. Martini's offer of £2 for any person who could ride the grey for 2 seconds was accepted once, but the rider only saw him for a second. He threw Waite every time. On the 15th of October 1904 in Brisbane, in the Charleville Times, Billy Waite's splendid rough riding exhibition in a Poley saddle on the notorious Kruger. We compliment Waite on his horsemanship. Old Dargan was brought in. Martini asked a rider and placed £2 into the hands of the press representative to be given to the rider, who retained his seat for 2 minutes. Waite mounted the old grey, who set to work and concluded the show by proving that he was a buck-jumping to rid himself of his mount. On the 26th of January 1905, in the Toowoomba Chronicle in Queensland, a horse belonging to the popular Mr. Cook was next brought in and ridden by Billy Waite, after which he took up a local passenger behind, who showed that he was no novice by the way he stuck to the horse. Ned Kelly, ridden by Billy Waite, and the boy from Nowra, showed no inclination to buck, and it was not until the services of one of the clowns was requisitioned that he did anything startling. He soon showed that he could buck when the latter crossed his back, and he very quickly upset the man of bloomers and face powder. Another local horse was then ridden by Waite in his usual masterly fashion. The redoubtable Bobs was the last, but not the least, item on the program, and after some difficulty, Waite succeeded in mounting him. He rode him in a Poley saddle, and the fact that the horse bucked for some time in a most emphatic manner showed what sort of champion horseman he undoubtedly is. In the end, Waite did come to the ground, but it looked as if he intentionally did so. On the 8th of February 1905, in the Warwick Examiner in Queensland, Martini's Australian Rough Riders show performed in Warwick on Saturday and Monday nights. On both occasions, the show was well patronised. The feature of the performance was the exhibition of buckjumping by the company's outlaws. Billy Waite, who is connected with the show, proved to the satisfaction of the spectators that in an ordinary English saddle he is able to ride any horse brought in. Waite is a typical Australian bushman and is thoroughly at home on the worst buckjumper, and needless to say, Martini has a few of the very worst class. A couple of local horses were led in and tried, but Waite soon proved he was the master of them. The show includes a dozen of the best buckjumpers, and Billy Waite, the king of the riders, gave some interesting exhibitions. On the 24th of February 1906, in the Port Denison Times and Bowen Advocate of Queensland, buckjumping contest. A buckjumping match has been arranged in Sydney between Mr. Clark, acting for Professor Screwthorpe, and Mr. Martini to take place on February the 28th. Martini's man Waite to ride 3 of Screwthorpe's horses, Screwthorpe to ride 3 of Martini's horses, and the winner to take £150. Billy Waite is a Proserpine native and joined Martini's show when it visited Bowen 3 years ago. Martini will back Waite to ride any horse that can be produced in Australia. On the 21st of March 1906, in the Warwick Examiner of Queensland, the big contest in the riding of the buckjumpers between Professor Screwthorpe, a Queensland champion of the pigskin, and Billy Waite, the clever rough rider attached to Martini's show, took place in Sydney on Saturday night. After a lot of wrangling between the principals, Martini and Screwthorpe over the dimensions of Screwthorpe's saddle, and much waste of time, Martini eventually waived the point. Waite rode in his usual saddle of an ordinary hunting pattern, while Screwthorpe's was a light variety of the ordinary buckjumper's saddle. Waite rode 3 horses supplied by his opponent, and they were each varminty and wicked in their ways. It took a long time to saddle and bridle them. They were found very ordinary actors in the buckjumping line. Billy Waite put them through in quite a comfortable manner, one after the other. Then Bob's was produced, and Screwthorpe duly got seated. The champion outlaw gave one of the finest performances with a variety of high, twist and side screwing, but Professor Screwthorpe never even lost a rather finished style of seat and never looked like being shifted at any time of the bout. When Bob's was tired, he dismounted amid uproarious applause. He declined to ride the other 2 horses and allowed Waite to claim the wager, depending on the verdict of the 3 judges as to which was the best horseman. He said all he wanted to do was to ride Bob's, whilst Martini again made the claim that no man could ride his champion in a fair hunting saddle. It was an exciting show, marred only by the long-winded delay over the terms mentioned. So Billy then took out the title of Champion Roughrider of Australia. On the 28th of April 1906 in the Port Denison Times and Bowen Advocate, a Buckjumper rider's experiences. You ask me what other sensation a rider has when he gets on a really good buckjumper. The speaker was Billy Waite, the Bowen horseman who's earned fame for his riding in all parts of Australia, and particularly with Martini's buckjumping show, and he leant back in the chair to reflect. Well, now I will tell you, he continued after a brief pause, but the question is a bit of a woodener. Frequently a horse gives a couple of bad bucks and you simply lose your eyesight, forget everything and feel like a bloke who is chloroformed. You don't know which way the moke is going to go or what is going to happen. As long as a man can keep his head and watch his moke's head, he's right. But once you lose your moke's head, you're a goner. My advice to anyone wanting to try a bucker is to ride loose and keep balance. I've been riding buckjumpers ever since I was 10 years old. I got my earliest experiences with riding calves, and I can tell you I had fun. I was 12 when I entered the first competition and was lucky enough to cop it. That was in Ayr between Bowen and Townsville. Have you any special method of conquering buckers? Jump on him and get at him. Work him out until the moke hasn't a kick on him. Of course, if it is a moke that runs at you and wants to bite, I can cure him in 2 minutes. I get a revolver and take the bullets out of it. I walk up to him and fire at his nose with a blank cartridge. He will never try and kick again. You can do anything with a horse after that. I have ridden in every buckjumping competition in Queensland and never saw a man use a bigger saddle than I do now, an ordinary hunter. Of course you have had some lively rides at times. The roughest ride I ever had was on a mule on a station near Bowen. I asked the owner if he were quiet and he said yes. When I mounted him, there was a cheer, and the mule flew off straight for a tree 300 yards away, bucking in great style. It bumped into the tree and got me off, but I made up my mind to go again. I was told the moke always went for this same tree, so I got an axe and chopped it down. Then I had another go at him. He started off from the house and again made for the tree, and when he found it was not there, how did he perform? But I beat him and I brought him to a standstill. On another occasion at Delganelli, I asked for a horse. They had a fine-looking bay cob there. I asked if he was quiet. Quiet, said the bloke who owned the station. Where are some of those old gins? I'll put one on. I said, never mind about the gins. If they can ride him, I think I can. When putting the crupper on, I turned in the direction of the house and saw heads stuck out of every window and I smelt a rat. My word, did he buck. But I stuck to him and dished him bad. The bloke at the station told me after it was the first time he'd ever been beaten. Where, in your opinion, do the worst buckers come from? Way up north of Queensland. Horses there are broken in one day and get away the next, and perhaps it is 8 or 9 years before they're caught again. And then in the Port Denison Times and Bowen Advocate, during the performance of Martini's show, which was brought to a conclusion the same night, Billy Waite was presented with a handsome inscribed gold medal for defeating Professor Screwthorpe and obtaining the Championship of Australia, and also backing to the extent of £200 against any rider in Australia. On the 21st of March 1929, there was a recollection in the Gundagai Independent, and it says, when Waite and I left Martini's show, all the money we had in our pockets was 1 shilling. This was in New South Wales, and everyone knew we'd been travelling with Martini, and they could not understand why we were on the track. We told them we were looking for work. We had no money or tucker. But a station owner said he had an outlaw that he'd like Waite to ride in a pony saddle out in the open. When Waite proved to him he was as good in the open as he was in a calico enclosure, we got all the work we could handle. Travelling with a buckjumping show is a very tiring game when one has to show night after night, and I've seen Waite so tired he could hardly sit on a horse. On the 17th of April 1907, in the Western Star and Roma Advertiser, those who remember the buckjumping displays given by Professor Screwthorpe in Roma a couple of years ago, and the skill with which the half-caste Billy Waite used to ride the outlaws in Martini's show at Roma a few months earlier, will be interested in the following telegram sent to us by Professor Screwthorpe from Cobar, New South Wales on Saturday. Snips and Frisco threw Martini's champion, Billy Waite, last night. On the 26th of May 1907 in the Brisbane Truth, Billy Waite, the Champion Roughrider, and the Dempsey family of breakers have got together for a formidable team of buckjumpers, including the noted deep-water outlaw Rise Up, and are now doing the New South Wales country towns. Billy Waite defies any horse on earth to throw him out of a hunting saddle and cheerfully invites owners of vicious brutes to bring them along. In Sydney, Billy and his wife Marion Smith became the star attraction of the Wild Australia show. On the 31st of December 1907 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, Waite's Buckjumping show. W. Waite, late of Martini's Buckjumping show, has got together a team of buckjumping horses, ponies, donkeys and mules and will open for a season at Newtown near St George's Hall. A prize will be offered to anyone riding the horse Rise Up for 1 minute in an English hunting saddle. Waite offers to ride any horse brought to the show. On the 28th of January 1908, Buckjumping show to tour Great Britain. At Bathurst, Mr. Ray of the Royal Hotel Wellington and Harry Taylor of Bedford and Taylor, well-known auctioneers, have together with Mr. Pratley of Bathurst and Mr. Tees of Wellington formed a syndicate for the purpose of launching a buckjumping show to tour Great Britain. The service of Billy Waite has been bespoken and businesslike efforts are now being put forward to secure the best riding talent and a number of outlaw horses. Several other entirely Australian features are to be added to give the show wider variety. It is expected that the show will be shipped by the Drayton Grange about the 18th of March. Meanwhile, he's in Queensland and in the Darling Downs Gazette on the 27th of February 1908, whip cracking by Billy Waite clearly demonstrated that he was also a master of the stock whip, and for his fine performance he was warmly applauded. And on the 14th of May 1908 in the Wellington Times in New South Wales, the best type of Australian horseman such as Waite has a seat literally of iron. Nothing, however unexpected, would discontent him. Waite is there till the horse is actually rolling with him, and it is when that last calamity happens that he'll be seen at his best. I have never seen any British rider who could extricate himself from a bad position so deftly as Waite. A horse will rear and crash backwards with Waite a score of times, and on not one occasion touch him as it falls. Waite numbers his smashes by thousands, and is still at 31 sound practically in wind and limb. Waite on a docile mount isn't a very notable figure. Billy Waite has a defter hand at escaping from a bad fall, and is a finer all-round horsemaster, inasmuch as any horse that another man can ride will go well enough with him, and some other horses that no man could ride, and that few other men would attempt to ride, will submit to him. On the 12th of May 1909 in the Northern Star of Lismore, New South Wales, the Australian buckjumpers showed last evening to a very good house. Billy Waite gave another of his wonderful exhibitions with the whips, including the 50-foot monster stock whip. His cracking with the bullock whips was a treat to see and hear. Some trial horses were brought in and successfully ridden by Hawkins and Waite. The evening was brought to a close with an exhibition by Billy Waite on Grey Echo. Waite is undoubtedly a fine horseman. Tonight the Lismore season will be brought to a close, and the feature of the show will be an exhibition by Waite on Snips. This is not usually done. The last occasion when Snips was ridden was at the stadium, when Waite remained on top for about 18 seconds. A fine display of horsemanship may be anticipated. There will also be several changes of horses this evening. The buckjumpers will visit Grafton and Casino next. And in an article on the 31st of December 1910 in the Melbourne Australian shows a photo from Queensland of Billy Waite, the rough rider and stock whip expert, and his wife. On the 6th of July 1910 in the Sydney Referee, Mr. Philip Lytton, who is financing the enterprise, has asked us to publish the following. Arrangements are now being made for the departure of the Australian buckjumpers. Mr. Hollingworth is in Java preparing for a tour embracing Java, Singapore, Bombay, Calcutta and London. A special team of rough riders headed by Billy Waite, a team of Australian blacks for corroborees, together with 40 head of horses, will be shipped by the Euralius this month. Mr. Philip Lytton is sending the enterprise to England on his own account. Some delay was experienced in sending the combination away owing to the death of that noted outlaw Snips, but an equally unmanageable substitute has been secured from the north of Queensland. And on the 18th of May 1918 in the Melbourne Leader had a recollection of the Lucknow division in 1909 and 1910, where it said that General Mann was a steward of the Calcutta Turf Club. He was a keen racing and hunting man, and despite his increasing years was a fine polo player. With coal and Australian-bred gelding he purchased as a charger from the well-known shipper Mr. Steve Margret's, and won steeplechases at Calcutta, Lucknow and Maunt. On one occasion while riding in a military steeplechase in England, General Mann accomplished a remarkable feat. His mount fell early in the race, but as the horse was rising from the ground, he caught hold of the tail and, running behind him for a few strides as it was making off, leapfrogged onto its hind quarters and was put onto the saddle. With considerable difficulty, General Mann recovered the reins and gradually made up lost ground and won the race after a great finish. General Mann had, I presume, still has a great liking for Australians. When Billy Waite arrived in Lucknow with his buckjumping show, General Mann and his favourite staff officer, Captain Rattle Barrett, Major when I last heard of him, took him in charge, with the result that Billy had crowded horses every night and made more money in Lucknow than in any other city in India. On the 25th of June 1911 in the Perth Sunday Times, Wild Australia in England. I was down at the Crystal Palace on the 24th of May and had a look at the first performance of Wild Australia, to which the general public were admitted. Hundreds of Cockneys and their country cousins were there. Billy Waite's biggest stock whip, it is only a trifle 53 foot long, set them thinking, and they loudly cheered the plucky little woman who held the cigarette in her mouth for him to cut in half. And she wasn't blindfolded as they are in the stock whip turns at the big London halls. Miss Cleopatra's box of snakes was also an eye-opener for them, especially one mobster weighing 63 pounds, Miss Benita Drosler's rifle shooting, caught on at once. And Miss Marion Waite's manipulation of the same long thong is also A1. Miss Agnes Hyland gave them an idea of how an Australian bush girl could hang on to a buckjumper, and later brought down the house when she appeared on Bayleaf in a very graceful riding act. I reckon Billy Waite's stock whip turned to be absolutely the best I've seen since I've been home, and I've cited all the top notches from your side. After the show was over, I found my way around behind and had a yarn with Mr. Neve. He explained that they lost one horse on the voyage, and so far the total expenses of the concern from start down to the present day was £10,000. It's a big amount, but see how we are advertised. Our great show bills of Wild Australia are in every town in England. The stockyards, the building adjacent, the open-air amphitheatre that can seat 3,600 people easily, has cost a tidy sum of money. But I've a grand crowd with me, and we all work together, and if we have fair weather, Wild Australia is going to be right on top. And in the Sydney Stock and Station Journal on the 30th of June 1911, Wild Australia at Empire Festival, most exciting display at the Crystal Palace. Evidently, Mr. A.E. Neve has made a great hit with his team of Australian buckjumpers in England, for the London Morning Leader, a halfpenny paper with an immense circulation, says under the above heading, Wild Australia at the Festival of Empire will be popular among Britons of all ages and sizes. An exposition of genuine horsemanship was the description in which Sir Newton Moore, Premier of Western Australia, recommended it to a specially invited audience on Saturday. In such a show, the buckjumper is naturally the star performer, the hero of the ring. Wild Australia is a perfect feast of buckjumping, and while Billy Waite or Ned Lloyd or Tom McConville or any of the other bush lads is up to the spectator, gets more thrills in 20 seconds than he probably experienced in the preceding 20 years. The ring represents an Australian stockyard from a large cattle station way back in the Never Never country. They call these brutes outlaws in the woolly Antipodes, and 3 of the most noted outlaws in Australia are in this show. Miss Cleo Dreschler charms crocodiles and snakes, and what is much harder, English audiences as well. Altogether, Wild Australia is an exhilarating show not to be equalled anywhere else in London. To see these stockmen from down under tackle this wild stuff is a revelation in daredevil riding. When the first horse entered the ring, clapping his hoofs together over his head, the Metropolitan policeman on duty and at the ring gate leapt the stockade like a fawn. It took 3 stockmen 5 minutes to get a saddle on the brute, and then one of them succeeded in scrambling on his back. A crack of the stock whip, and away the happy couple went around the ring. The beast jumped, reared, bucked, kicked, sprang, and did every wicked thing known in the Never Never land, but its rider didn't get off until he wanted to, and the audience cheered admirably. Wild Australia is not all buckjumping, however. There is some wonderful rifle shooting by Miss Bolter Dreschler, a girl in her early teens described as the Champion Roughrider of Australia, who cuts her name out in 30 shots in 30 seconds and plays tunes on suspended steel bars. Miss Marion Waite is an artist on the stock whip. She can crack 4 at a time, holding 2 in each hand, with her whips from 8 to 38 foot long. and in the Broken Hill Barrier Miner on the 1st of September 1911. The London correspondent of the Advertiser writes on July the 28th, Billy Waite, the clever show rider attached to the Wild Australia show at the Crystal Palace, has fallen foul of the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals over what he alleges is a common practice in Australia, namely that of biting a horse's ears to distract its attention whilst being saddled. He was fined 40 shillings and costs by the magistrate, and Alfred Neve, the manager of Wild Australia, was also fined the same amount for permitting Billy to indulge in the Australian custom. According to the prosecution, the horse upon which Waite exercised his teeth was on the 12th of July. He was brought into the stockyard and tied to the rails to be saddled. Waite held the animal's head to enable this to be done, and whilst the saddle was being fixed, he took hold of its ear, twisted it around, bit it and drew blood. When spoken to by the Society's inspector, Waite admitted that he had bitten the animal's ear, but stated it was common practice in Australia. Neve, who was in the arena at the time, said he did not actually see the occurrence, but it was a common practice. Inspector Knight of the RSPCA detailed the treatment outlined by counsel and also complained of the arrangement of the strap by means in which the animal was made to appear as though it was bucking. Mr. A. Case corroborated the inspector's statement. He was quite certain that the bite caused the animal pain. This was evidenced by the continual twitching of the ear afterwards. The witness was of the opinion that certain straps were so arranged as to irritate the animal and cause it to buck. When he examined the animal, he found recent abrasions on the ear, a little dried blood and several old scars. Mr. Stevenson, a veterinary surgeon, also corroborated the inspector's evidence and admitted freely that the stocks were in very good condition. In fact, he congratulated Neve upon their condition, and the only advice he gave to him was to leave off biting. Neve on oath said that the horse was a noted outlaw in Australia, a wild, untamable horse. Only a few days before the occurrence, it had thrown its rider right out of the areas. At the performance on the 12th of July, it threw its rider and fell on him, and he's since been incapacitated. Waite then caught hold of it, and he would admit that he had bitten the animal's ear. He absolutely denied that the flank strap complained of was put on to make the animal buck. They were used to prevent the saddle coming off over the animal's head when it bucked. The chairman subsequently said that there did not seem to be any great injury to the ear, certainly not of a prominent character. The evidence, however, proved conclusively that it was admitted that the ear was bitten on this occasion, and as they thought that it could not be done without cruelty, they convicted. The evidence was very conflicting and not altogether satisfactory, especially in regard to the flank strap. There was no evidence to show that Neve caused the horse to be so treated on that particular day, but there was evidence to show that he knew that the biting was done and permitted it. In his case, the fine would be the same. So on the 9th of December 1911, Billy, aged 29, arrives in New York from departing Liverpool, England. He sailed on the ship the Baltic. On the 30th of April 1912, in the Maryborough Chronicle and Wide Bay and Burnett Advertiser in Queensland, there's a detailed article written by Billy Waite, the Champion Roughrider of Australia, on how to tackle a vicious horse. It was at my own house in Proserpine, Queensland, that I first put a leg over a horse, and after some years spent helping to drove mobs of fats, as we call cattle, I managed to pick up enough horsemanship to win my first buckjumping competition at Bowen, Queensland, at the age of 16. Now I'm going to explain how vicious horses should be ridden, in my opinion. I have never been a believer in the military style of riding when a man sticks on by gripping with his neck and legs. This is all very well with a horse that is so tame that he can't move it out of its own way, but it can hardly be called perfect horsemanship. A real bad horse, a buckjumper I mean, would soon have you off if you only rode with your legs. To ride a vicious horse, it is much better to be a balanced rider. Though I don't want to obtrude my own methods over such, I may say that I never use my knees to a horse at all. I keep on solely by balance. It doesn't matter if the saddle is half off or whether I'm on the back rump or his shoulders. I can stick on by balancing myself. How should one deal with a vicious horse? Well, that's a very difficult question, for horses are like men. Each has a different nature. Some are amenable to kindness, in fact, are only made worse by rough treatment. Others, the majority by the way, must be mastered, and the quicker you do it, the better. Jump on, and even if you are chucked off, get on again without the faintest sign of apprehension. If a horse sees that you funk him, even in the slightest degree, he will always be your master. Try to foresee what kind of jump will be had, and move around accordingly. Give him a thorough hit with your whip all the time, and sooner or later, if you retain your confidence, he will give in to you. When I first get hold of a buckjumper, I simply jump on and balance myself on its back, sliding backwards and forwards just as he moves, or as we call it at home, crawling all over him, sticking my thumbs into his neck, doing anything in short except gripping with my legs. Here's a tip for riders of which everybody may not perhaps agree, but of the good sense of which I personally am convinced. The very fact of gripping a bad horse with your legs is sufficient to let him know that if you find difficulty in keeping on, he can take advantage of you as a result of his own increased confidence. It is strange how deceptive appearances are in the matter of buckjumping horses. The worst kind to ride is the real bad kicking horse. His pet dodge is to stand quite stationary and firmly on his forelegs and kick his heels high in the air. He thus shoots you over his head. If you're not a balanced rider, you can't ride him. If he is the horse that keeps bucking off the ground with all his legs in the air at once, he simply tries to shoot you downwards. All you have to do is sit still. By the way, here's a point that most people don't know and very often horrifies humanitarians of the old womanish order. If a bad-tempered horse finds that he can't throw you, he'll often start squealing, kicking up a horrible noise. People who don't understand are apt to think you're hurting him, but it is only his way of showing his temper, like a spoiled child does. A rearing horse is one of the most troublesome beasts to ride because he may possibly be pulled right backwards down on you, involving injury to himself and you. When a horse rears, you should lean forward as far as possible on his neck and put both of your arms around it, bringing them together under his jaws. Not only does this bring your weight forward, thus lessening the risk of pulling him back on you, but it also tickles him in some sort of way. For horses are very sensitive in this respect and makes him hold his head down and gets on all fours again. 7 years ago, I met a man called Martini at Charters Towers, Queensland. He had a horse called Dargan's Grey, and he offered £5 for anyone who could ride him for a minute. Well, I jumped on and rode Dargan's Grey without any trouble, and not only did Martini pay me the money at once, he offered me a big contract to tour with the circus. So I did, and later challenged a man called Lance Scunthorpe for the Buckjumping Championship of Australia. The verdict was given by the spectators, a very fair method, don't you think? While the public and the referee gave me unanimous verdict as the winner. Finally, advice to men who have to ride vicious horses. Although it is a long business to learn to ride on the balance, and the way to do this, to sum up, is to watch the way he's going to go and go with it. On the 25th of February 1912 in the Sydney Truth, Bravo Billy, sentiment from a stock whip swinger. Sir, just a card wishing you the compliments of the season. I've just arrived here after finishing my long and weary 6-month contract with Wild Australia in England. Wild Australia is still touring in England with 2 Australians, the others having a Japanese and Mexican flavouring. It was time to quit. I'm under good management and big bookings here with my stock whip act. Yours, etc., Billy Waite, Champion Roughrider of Australia, New York, USA. And in brackets, it is pleasing to note that at least one Australian champion is imbued with the Wild Australia principle with a thoroughness that is touching. Mr. Waite, we understand, is a mixture of blood of native to the Australian soil. Probably it was the white section of him that rebelled at the Jap and Greaser flavouring. Anyhow, bully for Billy, we want more enthusiasts like our Champion Roughrider. And then on the 10th of February 1912 in the Perth Truth, a chatty letter from Agnes Hyland, dated New York, 15th of December, saying that she, Frank Brown, and Billy Waite and his wife have just finished 6 months of a long and weary contract with Wild Australia. On the 30th of July 1913 in the Sydney Referee, Billy Waite in Kansas City. From Kansas City, USA comes a card with best wishes from Billy Waite and wife. It gives a photograph of some of the stock whip arts of the much-travelled Australians who are billed as the famous Australian bush whip marvels. In a letter from Kansas City, Billy Waite adds, I've been over here for about 2 years and getting on just fine. My stock whip act is doing great guns and I'm in on the boom. I like the USA very much. One meets many fine fellows over here. Since leaving good old Australia, I've toured Java, India, Europe, England, Ireland, Scotland, and the whole of the USA. I hope to be home again soon, with the kindest regards to all of Australia and best wishes to the referee. On the 11th of May 1913 in the Perth Sunday Times, the Wild Australians and their invasion of London, an interesting letter from a member of the band. An interesting letter from a member of the Wild Australian troupe that is showing in England during the coronation. The Wild Australian name was settled by a London board of directors before the show arrived home. The Australian representatives tried to have it altered to the Australian Buckjumpers, but they were unsuccessful. The show was never intended for the Crystal Palace, the distance and expense being against success as compared with the opening at the White City. Again, those that were supposed to be in charge upon leaving Australia were outvoted. The Festival of Empire exhibition at the Palace was a complete frost, although the fact of the coronation being on kept great numbers in London who would otherwise have attended. The shows at the Palace made, without one exception, a heavy loss. Certainly huge numbers did attend, but the expenses were terrific. The building ran into over £3,500. 25% had to be paid out for receipts as rent of the space occupied. The advertising ran to over £4,000. The poster account alone was £800. One press dinner cost 120 guineas, and the London directors furnished a large house for the employees. There were some of the best riders in Australia in the combination. Part of the show had toured all of the principal cities of India for 12 months and was showing in Bombay at the time it was purchased. The last nights there were far better than somewhere in London. One of the riders, Billy Waite, was presented with a valuable souvenir purchased by the officers of the regiment by the commandment of Bombay, for he described it from the centre of the ring, his fearless and clever horsemanship. The commandant commended it to the attention of the house packed with military people. He also described Australians as the most daring and intrepid horsemen possibly in the world. Scores of cavalrymen came into the ring and were mounted, and after adjusting everything to their liking, and after examining every bit of gear and expressing themselves as being satisfied, the slip was loosed, and the next moment there was to be seen crawling through the slip rails a very sore and discomforted would-be rider. In one military hospital there were 18 men, mostly with gravel rash, at one time. The medical officers reported this, and the result was that an order was posted in the barracks that no more officers or privates were to ride in any public entertainments. In London, numbers of American and Mexican riders accepted the challenge against the Australians. Not one of them sat on bobs for 10 seconds, and they were limping about the show like cripples. In competitions with other horses, the Australians allowed the competitors to ride in their own saddles, and after one or two of them had been arrived at by the ambulance men, the men from New South Wales and Queensland would ride the same horses without a saddle at all. Whatever else happened, one thing is certain: the show advertised the fact that Australians could ride. They wore no red shirts in their riding, their hair was the ordinary length, they did not swank about like certain other riders of other nations are accustomed to, there were no bowie knives or guns on their belts, and they pulled off their riding gear as soon as possible after their turn in the ring. One of the ladies was never beaten in her challenge to catch, saddle, ride and break any outlaw brought into the ring in 3 hours. She gained great kudos for breaking horses in the hunting districts, packed houses being the rule on these occasions. When the show was under contract with the Palace people, the latter insisted upon putting a spectacular scene on, and the show people had to do their best with the poor old Kelly gang. This was a cause of a little trouble with the employees. They did not like this sort of thing, as it was not what they signed on for. It was found out afterwards that one of the boys was a nephew of one of the Kellys, and doubtless it was inconsiderate on the part of the proprietors to riddle his relation twice a day with about a score of bullets. Anyhow, we finished the engagement and had no complaints from the people who were paying, which was the principal importance. Every man and woman in the show tried to make a success of it, but in the face of it being one of the most disastrous years for amusement promoters for the last 15 years, and older and better equipped concerns ending the season with heavy losses, it is perhaps not to be wondered at that the experiment of landing a lot of horses and employees thousands of miles distant, coupled with the considerable differences of opinion between Londoners and Australians as to how the show was to be put on, the scheme was not a financial success. The receipts were over £200 per day at times. So, as you could see from those articles, things did not succeed as they hoped in England with the Australian Buckjumpers. Bill Boyang had the following to say of that tour and the latter life of Billy Waite and his wife. Disaster came to the Wild Australia show in England, owing probably to changed climatic conditions. The horses would not buck. Then someone accused Waite and other riders of using cruel devices to make their animals do their part. The show closed down, and finding himself out of work, Billy Waite went to America. So another article about Billy Waite in America was written in the Sydney Referee on the 7th of May 1913. Billy Waite, who is now in the US, writes to Mr. H. Porter of Sydney. While in Cincinnati, I received 2 stock whips you made for me and the boomerangs. I've been very successful with your 75-foot whip, which caused a sensation in the US and in Canada. I am touring with my wife on a big circuit. At Winnipeg, Canada, I was challenged to crack the big whip with one hand in the open air. I won the wager in one of the public streets and was cheered by a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000. When I gave the open air show, the street was covered with snow and the air was freezing. Although I have more work here than I can do, I think I'll be going back to Australia about the end of the year. Instead, the Waites moved to England during World War I. Then they went to Canada. It was here that Billy joined the famous Scottish poet Will Ogilvie in breaking horses for the war effort. Ogilvie was in Australia for 12 years, from 1888 until 1900, and wrote lyrical bush poems, which are some of our best, and his poetry is still favoured by many people in the outback. On the 27th of October 1915, in the Northern Miner, a Charters Towers paper, from Charleville, Major Deacon paid a flying visit today and returned by the Western Mail to Brisbane. He enlisted 11 horsemen, some of the finest riders of Australia, and amongst them is listed Billy Waite. On the 9th of May 1918, in the Cobram Courier of Victoria, Australian buckjumpers of a few years back are doing their bit. Billy Waite, the Australian champion who rode the famous bobs at Cootamundra some years ago, is horse breaking for the Army in Canada. Later in the USA, they toured with the All-Film circuit where they cracked whips as long as 65 foot long and threw boomerangs. They appeared in various shows along with Annie Oakley, Tom Mix and Buffalo Bill. Billy continued to win rough riding contests, often while cracking a stock whip. On the 31st of January 1924, in the Young Daily Witness of New South Wales, many of our readers who saw Billy Waite's riding Wild Outlaws at Young many years ago will be interested in this from the pen of Snowy Baker. By the way, I did an episode on Snowy Baker, which was episode 191, so if you're interested to know more of that interesting Australian, take a listen to that one. One of my many pleasant meetings in Chicago was with the wonderful Australian horseman Billy Waite. Waite, a Queenslander by birth, is considered by those in this land competent to judge as one of the greatest horsemen that ever straddled. Tom Mix saw me that he saw Waite put a flat English saddle on the worst bucker they could produce, and as he bucked, Billy sat with a stock whip in each hand cracking a merry tune. Waite and his wife live in Chicago. Their work is an Australian act in vaudeville. He told me that he had given up riding ruffins entirely. I have Billy to thank for teaching me to throw a boomerang. I do stunts with various stock whips, but when I saw Waite and his wife do their act, I was a bit sorry for myself. And there's a photo of Marion in 1925 at the Palace Theatre on Broadway in New York. In the 1930 American census, it states that they were living at Chicago, Illinois, at the Lorraine Hotel. On the 24th of December 1936, in the Nambour Chronicle and North Coast Advertiser of Queensland, the following, written by James Mooney, appeared in the North Queensland Register. Some time ago, you had much to say about Thurp McConville in one of your widely read buckjumping articles, and you stated that those who accompanied Thorpe to England included Billy Waite and Jack Morrissey the whipcracker. When the Wild Australia show crashed in England, Morrissey and his wife worked up a whip-cracking and sharpshooting act, and with Billy Waite crossed over to America. Their first appearance was at a much-boomed rodeo, but they rode the fierce Mustangs with such case that the Yanks didn't like it, and the Australians received a cold reception. To make matters worse, Morrissey casually asked those running the show to put a flank rope on the Bombshell to make the cow buck. Now Bombshell was billed as the most notorious outlaw in the USA, and Morrissey's remarks hurt those cowboys, and they took good care, and he and Waite got no further opportunities to appear in the big rodeo rings. Waite joined a circus. So at the age of 59, Billy Waite is listed in the 1940 census as living in New York, and his occupation was circus performer. Billy Waite died on the 12th of June 1941 at Brentwood, Long Island, New York, USA at the age of 60, and he's buried in the Kensico Cemetery where his brass plaque marks the grave of this famous buckjumper. Billy Waite was a fine physical specimen. He was 6 feet in his socks, tall and straight as a reed, with muscles rippling all over his lithe frame. A good-natured grin displayed 2 rows of flashing white teeth in his enormously broad mouth, which was always on his face, even when he was picking himself up from the sawdust, where he landed in a huddled heap after being thrown by a famous outlaw horse. And on the 26th of September 1941 in the Richmond River Herald and Northern Districts Advertiser, It was something like 35 years since we last saw the electrifying packed rodeo tents with his exhibition on bobs. Strange to say, only a few days ago we ran across a clipping from the New York Times, which journal had half a column about the downfall of Marion Waite, who'd been reduced from having a cigarette flip from her lips every night in Ringling's circus by Billy Waite with a 70-foot bullwhip to selling toy whips at a street corner. Marion, it appears, was herself some whipster. She could pluck a pistol from the adversary's hand a score of yards away with a whip flick, and she and her husband were skilled users of the boomerang. And on the 12th of February 1942 in the Perth Western Mail, that 35-foot whip mentioned recently is not the longest stock whip that's been made and used. In fact, it's quite a baby. Mr. H. Porter of Sydney made a whip of 78 foot in length that was for that well-known rough rider, Billy Waite. Billy Waite stayed in America, joining the Whip and Boomerang Act. He headline billed for years, and he toured the vaudeville houses from one end of America to another. He also made a trip to England playing the Moss and Stoll circuit of theatres, as well as the big continental showplaces. He was outstanding at handling a 35-foot bullock whip without any effort. His supreme achievement, apart from rough riding, was with the boomerang. He could throw them with either hand and catch them as well. It was no effort for him to have two boomerangs in the air at the same time, travelling in opposite directions, and he could bounce them too. He would take a boomerang in his right hand, throw it forward so that it would hit the ground in front of him, bounce off the ground, and continue on its flight. In later years, he developed smaller boomerangs that could be used in theatres without fear of hitting anyone in the audience. It was really with these tiny boomerangs that Waite was such a success. He was never below star billing in any show. Waite never returned to his homeland. And Marion died on the 7th of February 1955 at the Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. Following a brief illness, Marion S. Waite, née Smith, beloved wife of the late William Waite and devoted friend of Beatrice Bosworth of Sarasota, Florida. They didn't have children, so therefore there's no descendants of the famous Billy Waite. So I hope you enjoyed his story and his place in buck-jumping and whip-cracking history.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.